Welcome to Blackbird, episode number 13. My name is James, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by the great independent journalist, Jeremy Hammond. Jeremy has been providing us with great coverage of the pandemic for the last year, and primarily on the current state of the pandemic, the vaccine, and all that stuff. So I anticipate this will be a great conversation, and you will learn a lot, and you will enjoy it. So with that, here is my interview with Jeremy Hammond. Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, sure. So I've been, you've been kind of making the rounds lately on Tom Woods, and I think twice on PQ. So I'm glad you took the time to stop by here today. Why don't you, for those who listen to my show but don't listen to Tom and Pete for some reason, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Well, my name is Jeremy Hammond. I'm an independent journalist, researcher, political analyst, author of several books, including Obstacle to Peace, the U.S. role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I've been doing journalism independently really since the Iraq War, and focused on foreign policy for most of the years I've been doing this. But around in 2012, my son was born, and so I really began researching the vaccine issue, shifted my focus, became cognizant of just what an important issue that is and how much people are being misinformed about that topic and public vaccine policy. And so I shifted my focus to that. And then, of course, last year with the COVID-19 pandemic and the authoritarian lockdown responses, I've been focusing for the past year, my work entirely on that problem and confronting the totalitarian threat we're faced with. So yeah, that's just a little bit about my background and the focus of my work. And really, I specialize in exposing state propaganda. So I essentially say, this is what we're being told. Here are the sources that they cite to support their arguments, and then here's what the sources really say, and this kind of thing. And so these are the conclusions we can draw about how we're being lied to. And so, that really is the focus of my work: is just exposing dangerous, harmful state propaganda that's intended to manufacture our consent for harmful policies.
I think one of the biggest criticisms that people kind of in our camp get is, at least, on Twitter, is that we're not scientists. So why should people listen to us when quote, the experts are saying the exact opposite of what communicators like you are saying and regurgitators like me are saying? What do you use to counter that assertion that you're not a scientist?
It's really simple. I say, well, just look at my sources. I'm citing peer-reviewed scientific literature, for example, in my articles. So, don't take my word for anything. Check the sources. This is what the science actually has to say. And this is really, again, just to give an example of what I do. For example, I've written a major series of articles on the flu shot. And it really, what kicked that off was a New York Times article in which the claim was made that a 2010 Cochrane review, Cochrane Collaboration is a prestigious international group that specializes in a type of study called meta-analysis. Citing this 2010 Cochrane review, saying that the review concluded that the science shows that the flu shot confers a great public health benefit. In fact, that's not their conclusion at all. Their conclusion was that the two fundamental assumptions upon which the CDC's flu shot recommendation is based are unsupported by scientific evidence. And they went so far in their criticism of the CDC as to accuse it of deliberately misrepresenting the science to support its policy. So you can, I'm not a scientist, but I can read the scientific literature and see what it actually has to say. So that's one point. Another point is that, I'm not a scientist, but scientists aren't independent journalists. Scientists, aren't doing what I'm doing. They're not approaching the topics from, kind of an outside of the box approach. They're all indoctrinated into their belief system. And I have the benefit of not having been through that indoctrination process. So I think that's another way to look at it entirely.
What would that indoctrination look like? Not every single epidemiologist is on the same page as the sort of narrative pushers.
Right.
So how do they get through school and still come out independent thinkers?
Well, that's it. I think that's a challenge for people, and many people do manage to do that. But this is true for education in general. I don't think it is. I'm not
Mhm.
specifically referring only to, like medical school or something like this. But I mean, you can talk to doctors and ask. But I've had many times doctors say to me that, or just say publicly that, the education they get on vaccines is really minimal. I mean, we have this as, as parents. So I'm a father. So as parents, we're told that, we can trust our doctors. Doctors know what they're talking about. And in my experience, this is completely untrue I would say, the majority of doctors, and doctors will tell you they don't get education on vaccines. What they learn is what we learned in like high school history, that, vaccines are wonderful. And, they eliminated smallpox from the planet and eliminated polio, and they're wonderful inventions, and they're safe and effective. And that's it. And this is essentially what doctors get in medical school. And so, and then most doctors don't do their own research. They're not digging deeply into the medical literature. And this is not, I'm talking about vaccines specifically, because this is an area where I've really focused my work, but this is true broadly, generally. I mean, another example is my experience trying to deal with leaky gut and having to diagnose myself. Because the doctors that I was encountering were completely ignorant. And, I would bring it up and say, well, I have leaky gut. And they would literally mock me because they weren't aware that this exists, and they think it's some kind of like pseudoscientific, nonsense. And I would tell them, like, just go to pubmed.gov, which is a government, NIH runs this website, it's a government website. And it's a database of the peer-reviewed literature. And you can go in there and do searches. And a lot of times full articles are available. If not, you can at least read the abstracts. And you can go in there and do a search for leaky gut or intestinal hyperpermeability, as it's also known. And it's completely uncontroversial in the literature. But, these doctors were totally ignorant. And not just that, their arrogance, their attitude toward me was so arrogant that they think they know things and are really totally ignorant. And it's just, these doctors are not spending their time like keeping up to date with the scientific literature. Mm-hmm. They learn what they learned in medical school, and then they go on and they run their practices and they just do things the way they've always done them. And this is, I think, broadly true for doctors. Now, there are exceptions. There are doctors out there who read the literature, who study the developments in science, and these are the doctors who are speaking out against the medical establishment and its way of doing things. So there's really a kind of a gap between what medical practice is in terms of standard of care in the medical establishment, and then what the science says. And really, they're practicing medicine a decade or two or three behind the science. And this is observable. I mean, you can observe this. You can go into the literature and see it.
I asked my doctor about hormone therapy or something like that. The stuff that like Sandra Summers, I think, is that her name? The Suzanne Summers, the stuff that she was promoting a few years ago, and probably still does, that was really catching on for men. And so I asked my doctor about it, and he said, well, I think it's really good pseudoscience. And I think this was a few years ago, and I'm pretty sure it's become a little more mainstream since then. I wonder what he would say if I asked him, at my next physical. So you, in addition to talking about vaccines, which is a very hot button issue, you also kind of take the other side. Like, for instance, you, a couple of months ago, wrote an article about whether the virus had been isolated. We hear it in a lot of conspiratorial/libertarian circles that the coronavirus has not been isolated, and so we can't really know anything about it. What's the reality there?
Yeah, this is one of the challenges, I think, for news consumers, is that there is misinformation from both sides. Of course, the preponderance. I want to preface my answer to that by stating this: that the preponderance of misinformation, whether we're talking about vaccines or foreign policy or the COVID-19 pandemic, is coming from the government and the mainstream media. Period.
Yep.
But that's not to say that there's not misinformation coming from the other side of things, and there is, and this is why it's a challenge to really, I think, make progress. For the health freedom movement is being held back because false claims coming out of the movement do harm the movement, because it legitimizes criticisms that we're spreading misinformation, and so I really try to take a more objective approach and criticize both sides wherever I see the misinformation coming from. I'm gonna challenge it. With the isolation question. There's people out there. There's a handful of voices who are speaking very loudly with this claim that the virus has not been isolated. But all they're really doing is it's just really a semantic game. This is really a nuisance claim to me, because it's such a distraction from real issues. And they're just saying, well, it's never been isolated in the dictionary sense of the word, like as though it was possible for scientists to somehow take a virus particle and suspend it in a vacuum so that it's completely separated from anything else. I mean, this is, maybe someday we'll have that technology, but we're stuck with the technology we have today. And so they say that the use of cell culture is not isolation. That any isolation of a virus that involves the use of cell culture is not isolation, because you're not suspending it in a vacuum. Basically, it's not isolation in the dictionary sense of the word. But scientists use the word isolation in this very specific way when they're talking about identifying viruses and like taking a sample from a patient and then identifying a virus within that sample. So the gold standard is the use of cell culture. I mean, this is the gold standard of virus isolation. And so, I mean, these people are essentially, if you follow their argument through to its logical conclusion, they're saying that no virus has ever been isolated. No virus has ever been proven to exist. And so there's this kind of a reductio ad absurdum argument that you can make to really dismiss this nonsense. It's been isolated. It's been isolated tens of thousands of times in whole genome sequenced by scientists all over the world. There's a database where they publish the genome sequences of isolates that they've obtained from patients all over the world. And there's this database they use it to track. And this is how they can track the evolution of the virus as it passages through the human population, and they identify unique variants and things like this. I mean, the claim that it doesn't exist is just such utter nonsense, and it's so harmful because it really does legitimize the other point of view that misinformation is being spread.
Does that relate to PCR testing as well?
Not directly. People get confused between PCR testing and virus isolation and whole genome sequencing. These are three different things. But it does relate in the sense that the reason I think like my own readers, a lot of them are confused about the difference between these things is because they're being conflated by these people who are arguing that the virus doesn't exist. And they're the ones conflating these issues and not making it clear to readers what the differences are. And so people think, oh, well, the PCR tests, they don't detect the whole virus. They only detect, like RNA fragments, and therefore it's not isolation. Well, no, it's not. PCR tests are not how isolation is done. But, I have readers who are legitimately confused about these things. So the PCR tests are, intended to really be confirmatory diagnostic tests. So they're not supposed to be used as the sole basis of diagnosis. And there's definitely legitimate criticisms, and this is a big issue. So the fact that, people who don't even have symptoms are getting tested and they're getting positive results and they're being counted as COVID-19 cases. And this is really institutionalized scientific fraud, because just because you have a positive test doesn't mean you have COVID-19. It doesn't mean you have an infection. And there's a difference between infection and disease. You can have an infection, but not develop the disease. The disease is the syndrome, the symptoms that are caused by the infection.
And that's the CDC's own definition of disease, right?
His clinical disease is defined as the symptom, the manifested symptoms. So, so this is a real problem. And of course, and then, it's compounded when they're doing the COVID-19 death counts, because, depending on jurisdiction, but I think broadly, people are, other states are doing it the same way they're doing it here in Michigan, where if you have a positive PCR test and then you die, you're counted as a COVID-19 death, and it's just automatic. And this is the way they've been, the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services has instructed people to count the numbers of COVID-19 deaths. Whereas you contrast that with the vaccine deaths, occurring vaccine-related deaths occurring like in nursing homes and things, where they go in with these mass vaccination campaigns. They vaccinate a bunch of elderly people, and then large numbers of them end up dying very, very shortly after the vaccination. And they say, well, this is a coincidence.
Which it very well might be. But
it very well be. But you notice that my point is that there's two different standards. So if you die and there's a temporal association with the vaccination,
right,
that's automatically assumed to be a coincidence. Whereas if you die after having received a positive PCR test, that's automatically assumed to have been you died of COVID-19.
Right. So, and the truth, I mean, once you're in a nursing home, like the lifespan is only a few months on average, from what I understand.
Right. In fact, I'm pretty sure that the average age of deaths caused by COVID-19 deaths is over the average age of life expectancy. I mean, this tells us a lot about the numbers of deaths, and what really is, it'd be interesting to look at years of life lost as a metric, and then comparing that to years of life lost as a result of the lockdown measures. Because of course, the global lockdowns are causing excess deaths among children, among infants, infant mortality, deaths from starvation, according to UN estimates. And so if we, compare, even if we give the lockdown advocates all of their assumptions and say, oh, okay, yeah, that these lockdowns spared X and X, X number of lives from COVID-19, even if we accept all those arguments and then compared, the years of life lost to the years of life lost from estimates of excess mortality as a consequence of the lockdowns, I think it's very easy to make the case that the lockdowns are doing far more harm than good. And of course, we don't have to accept their assumptions and their claims, because the scientific evidence is very clear at this point that the lockdowns really are not effective. They're not effective at all. And there's studies on this. I mean, there's a study published in The Lancet finding that there's no association between, the lockdown measures and mortality. And there's numerous studies showing that there's just no association between the lockdowns, especially the more extreme lockdown measures like stay-at-home orders and business closures. There's no association between those measures and better outcomes.
What about masks? What do we know about their efficacy? And what are we being told that's not true?
Well, what we're being told that's not true is that science supports the use of mandatory masking. This is false. This is a non-evidence-based policy. What science does support is the use of masks, certain types of masks in certain types of situations. So, and there's different types of studies on masks. Most of them for SARS-CoV-2 are observational studies. So they're just looking retrospectively at data. There's also mechanistic studies where, that you have just a theoretical kind of mechanistic approach where, well, yes, if you have a mask on and you cough and it's going to catch the larger droplets. And so, it's going to prevent those from being spread, to somebody else. And so, you have these types of arguments, but then there's a difference between, like theoretical kind of effectiveness, and where you assume, because of the function of a mask, that therefore it's going to have this effect, and in real world data. So what's really interesting is that the randomized controlled trials, which of course is, that's considered the gold standard of evidence, the RCTs don't show that masks are effective. And this is true even like in the healthcare setting.
Oh, wow.
With not just like cloth masks, but like with medical masks, surgical masks, and even with N95 respirators, where they show that respirators, randomized controlled trials show that respirators aren't more effective than surgical masks. So there's really counterintuitive data on masks, and where what we would expect perhaps in terms of effectiveness. It doesn't appear to be the case in real world settings. And there's explanations for this. I mean, for masks to actually work, you have to wear them properly for one. And most people don't do that, even if they know how. It's all kinds of, and then, there's another issue is like when you actually do cough or like you sneeze into a mask, it doesn't actually contain the particles. It just kind of blows them out the side, or it shoots them off in different directions. The evidence is there in terms of, yes, if you are in a situation where prolonged close contact with others is unavoidable, yes, it makes sense to wear a mask in that circumstance. If just out of courtesy for other people, this kind of thing, just as source control, where the idea is that, the person it's not, the mask isn't. Well, now they're saying that masks also protect you, but they're changing all decades of science on masks in the past several months. All the science is suddenly being turned upside down. So they're making this claim now that the cloth mask will protect you too. But really the idea was that it's used as source control, meaning that the wearer is protecting other people from yourself. So, but the idea that we all have to wear masks everywhere we go is completely nonsense. I mean, if you're in a situation where you can avoid close contact with others, it's completely pointless to wear a mask. Right.
And close contact doesn't just mean being within 6 feet of people, right? It means direct face-to-face contact for longer than, I think, like 10 minutes, right?
It was CDC, I think, actually changed this like last month or fairly recently. But for most of last year, the definition of close contact, CDC's definition was, being within 6 feet of someone for more than 15 minutes.
Right. So it's not like reaching past someone at the grocery store.
It's not like, I walked past somebody in the aisle and they were 5 feet away from me. No. Yeah, this is nonsense.
Right. And that's where I think that's because I don't use public transportation and my job is remote anyway. I don't go to an office. My experience with this is the only time I ever wear a mask is when I obviously feel like I don't need to. So I'm a little more resistant to it than maybe someone who is riding the bus every day.
I mean, same thing here. Exactly. If I did use public transportation and I was in a crowded subway or something, I would wear a mask. I mean, just not because I feel it's necessary, but just because I know people are scared and it would just give them comfort. And it's just as a matter of respect and, courtesy, I would do so. I don't have a problem with that. The problem I have is with these mandated masks where, you're not given a choice and you're threatened with punishment or, like here in Michigan, the governor before her orders were revoked by the Supreme Court, was threatening fines and punishment for not wearing masks and things. This is what I have a problem with. And then the idea that, I'm supposed to wear a mask to go to the grocery store here where I live. I mean, it's not as though I go into the grocery store and it's, like trying to get through a herd of cattle or something. I mean, we just don't live in that. Our area is not that populated. The stores are not crowded. I can easily go through the store and check out and never even encounter someone. I mean, it's ridiculous, the idea that I'm supposed to just always wear a mask, even in situations where it's completely pointless and absurd and an act of irrational fear. I will not act out of irrational fear. I refuse.
I live here in Minnesota where they're trying to legislate masks because the governor in his, benevolence wants to give up some of his emergency powers. And so he's asking the legislature to enact them instead. And the legislation as written says that masks are required in all public spaces until the CDC removes the recommendation for masks. Do you think that that's ever going to happen? I mean, what do you predict? And, I won't hold you to it, is the future of masking post-pandemic?
Oh, I think it's become, if it ever was about public health, I think that rationale has shifted to the point where now it's more about control. I think it was about control from the beginning, largely, but now I think it's about total control. They're claiming these authorities that they don't have, the authority to declare by fiat which businesses are, essential or non-essential, whose labors are non-essential in a society. I mean, these types of power, I mean, this is pure authoritarianism. I mean, this is totalitarianism. It's clear as day. They cannot possibly have such authority. I mean, the only legitimate authority that any government can possibly have is derived from the consent of the governed. And this is a basic principle of the United States, government. And so, when did we ever consent to when did we, the people, ever give the government the authority to, by fiat, close businesses, or dictate to us what we should do in terms of our own health, and what attire we should wear, and what we should put into our bodies in terms of vaccines, and and this is really the fundamental problem here, is that our fundamental human rights are under direct assault. And this was true before the pandemic, and the right to informed consent had been under, there's a war already being waged on our right to informed consent before the pandemic, and it just escalated above and beyond with the pandemic. In fact, before the pandemic, I was very confident that the health freedom movement, we were winning the argument, just because we have the facts on our side. And you can easily debate, these false claims, like easily go to the CDC's website and show how, the claims that the CDC makes about certain claims about vaccine safety are contradicted by its own sources. I mean, you can just example after example, you can show this, it's demonstrable. And so we were, I think, quite handily winning that battle and that war for our freedom. Despite the setbacks in terms of increasing numbers of states, because you could see that they were getting more desperate in terms of trying to remove exemptions from vaccines, and even getting California even going after medical exemptions and saying, well, no, we're going to interfere in the doctor-patient relationship and say, the doctor is not, when the doctor, Richard Pan, who was the leader of, the guy, like the main guy behind this legislation in California, came out and said, and he wrote this in a peer-reviewed article in a peer-reviewed journal, saying that the doctors who were writing vaccine exemptions are not practicing medicine; they're performing an administrative function in service to the state. And this is his view of medicine, and the role of, in his view, this is the proper role of doctors, and this is completely and utterly insane. I mean, we must stop this totalitarianism. And now you're seeing it with the COVID-19 pandemic, and the lockdown measures, and then and of course the end game of the lockdown measures has from the very beginning been mass vaccination. Mm-hmm. This has always been their exit strategy, and of course the implication of that is that mandates are coming, and so many of us have been fighting that war for long before the pandemic was even here, and we're still at it. But I think one good thing that's coming out of this is people are becoming awakened to what's really happening. I mean, they've seen, all the stuff we've been talking about for years in the health freedom movement. I mean, people are really starting to see it with their own eyes. I mean, in the past, we would say like, well, the FDA vaccine approval process is totally inadequate. And, just because a vaccine is FDA approved doesn't mean it's been proven to be safe and effective. And people would just kind of like dismiss that and not really pay any attention to it, just because it's just, state religion. People just have this faith in government, and a vaccine religion as a subsect of the state religion. But now, I think the masses are awakened to they can see it with their own eyes. I mean, they're reading in the media every day how, these vaccines have been scientifically proven safe and effective when the phase 3 clinical trials still haven't even been completed yet. When they are not FDA authorized. They're not FDA approved. They're authorized for emergency use, which is different. Emergency use authorization is for experimental products. And so, and of course, everyone can see with their own eyes. Obviously, we lack data on long-term effects. We have no data on long-term safety of these vaccines or long-term effectiveness of these vaccines. And so, everything we've been saying for so many years, people can see it now. It's just right out in the open, where all the problems we've been talking about, with the government saying, oh, well, they're safe. We have, preliminary data from a phase 3 trial that we can, based on that, we can declare, authoritatively and conclusively that they're safe. This is such nonsense. You cannot, absent randomized placebo-controlled trials, comparing long-term health outcomes, including all-cause mortality between vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals, any claim of safety is completely meaningless.
Generally speaking, how long is long-term?
Well, it could take years for effects of vaccines to manifest. I'll give an example of what I'm talking about. There's something in the literature. I mean, what the short-term trials are designed to look at, they're looking for what are known as adverse events. So you get the shot, you get a fever, you get the shot and you have soreness and swelling, or, sometimes there can be more serious events that occur. It kind of, and there's a temporal association with the vaccine. It's kind of typical adverse events that are known to occur with vaccines generally, so they're kind of looking just for a kind of a narrow range of harms from the vaccine. There's a whole other category of harms from vaccines that are kind of distinguished from adverse events. They're called non-specific effects. And so a non-specific effect is basically just an unintended consequence of a vaccine, but it's distinguished from, the adverse events in that they're really more long-term effects that you wouldn't really be able to anticipate, whereas adverse events are kind of, you can anticipate them, the type of harms that you might expect from a vaccine. But
that would be like a sore arm or something like that.
Yeah, exactly, okay. Exactly. Whereas non-specific effects could be something like what we see with the diphtheria, tetanus, and whole cell pertussis vaccine, which used to be used in the U.S. and other developed countries. It was switched to use a acellular pertussis vaccine component, the DTaP, as opposed to the DTP vaccine. So the DTP vaccine is still one of the most widely used vaccines in the world. It's used in developing countries still. And of course, the pre-licensure trials for that vaccine never examined mortality outcomes. They never looked at that. It was just assumed that, well, if the vaccines are effective at preventing the 3 target diseases, it's a combination vaccine, then therefore it will reduce mortality. That was the assumption. Well, researchers have studied that, particularly a team of researchers from Denmark have studied that, and all the best scientific evidence that we have to date shows that vaccine is associated with an increased rate of childhood mortality. So this is a detrimental non-specific effect of that vaccine, where what appears to happen is that it detrimentally affects children's immune systems, so that even though they might be protected from the target disease, they become more vulnerable to other infections, and they're dying from other causes. And so this is what I mean when I say that if you don't have if you're not looking at long-term effects, and I'm talking about all health outcomes, I'm talking about looking at rates of allergies, asthma, autoimmune diseases, cancers, fertility rates, mortality, all-cause mortality. I mean, we have to look at the broad range of health outcomes if we want to, see whether there's a causal association between vaccines and any negative health outcomes. Of course, one of the problems is, they don't look for these types of things in pre-licensure trials. They do not. And then the vaccines go to market and they have post-marketing surveillance, which is not a substitute for randomized controlled trials. And then they say, if anyone finds any signals, if anyone finds an association between any kind of vaccine and a harm, and they say, oh, well, it's just an observational study. It doesn't prove that there's a causal relationship, which is true. But then that's why we should be doing randomized controlled trials to look for these things. But then they say, well, it's already on the market. It's already standard of care. We can't do randomized controlled trials to look for long-term health outcomes now, because it would be unethical to deprive people of the benefits of the vaccine.
Just like it's unethical to ask people not to wear a mask.
Right. Yeah. And so, of course, this is the fallacy of begging the question. It's a logical fallacy. You have to do the science if you want to get the answers to these things.
So what do you think is the purpose of well, let me start by saying that I am not as vaccine skeptical or hesitant as some of the other people in our sphere. But that's also a completely uneducated position. And I do find it incredibly fishy that, for instance, the pharmaceutical companies are not held accountable when side effects and adverse reactions do happen. Right. From what I understand, there's just a huge budget for settling lawsuits that the government foots the bill.
Yeah, no, what happened is in 1986, the government passed a law. Well, because throughout the early 1980s, the vaccine industry was really, I mean, manufacturers were going out of business. I mean, they were literally going out of business because of vaccine injury lawsuits, primarily as related to the DTP vaccine, which was what was being used at the time, and also the oral polio vaccine, which every domestic case of polio in the U.S. after 1979 was caused by the live virus vaccine.
Gosh.
So there were lawsuits, and so this threatened. The problem for the government was that this threatened public policy, because public policy is they need to sustain and maintain high vaccination rates. That's a policy goal, and so that policy goal was threatened by the reduction in supply of manufacturers going out of business. And so the government stepped in and interfered in the market to say, well, we're going to grant legal immunity to manufacturers of vaccines whose products are recommended for routine use in children by the CDC. They were granted broad legal immunity. At the same time, the law established what's called the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, the VICP, which is funded by an excise tax on every vaccine dose administered. And so the effect of the 1986 law was to effectively shift the financial burden for vaccine injuries away from the pharmaceutical industry and onto the tax-paying consumers.
So what's the purpose of mass vaccination then? I mean, there's plenty of literature saying that vaccines are safe and effective, and there's plenty of literature saying that there are severe adverse reactions. So why is there no moderate position on this? Or is the moderate position skepticism without hysteria?
The public vaccine policy is an extremist position. It is extreme because what they're saying is that vaccination is a one-size-fits-all solution to disease prevention. This is not what science tells us. This is completely contradicted by all the totality of scientific evidence, which tells us very clearly, I mean, this is just common sense, that it must be an individual choice. Because every single vaccine, you hear this claim, this catchphrase, it's a marketing phrase, vaccines are safe and effective. This is an invalid generalization. Every single vaccine has a different profile of safety. It has a different profile of effectiveness. Every single individual is at different risk of the disease that a vaccine is intended to protect against. And every individual is at a different risk of injury and being harmed by the vaccine. And so the idea that policymakers in state capitals or in Washington, D.C. can do a population risk-benefit analysis for every single individual in the country, and just declare that for everyone with a very narrow category of what they call contraindications, where it's well, you practically have to have already had a very severe, potentially fatal reaction to a vaccine in order to get a contraindicated exemption from a vaccine. And so they're not looking at the fact that, here's a good example, under the VICP, the U.S. government has acknowledged that vaccines can cause brain damage manifesting as symptoms of autism. This was conceded in the case of Hannah Poling, whose injury was encephalopathy, which is any type of brain disease, damage, or disorder, including encephalitis, which is brain inflammation. And so a CDC director went on TV at the time, went on CNN and said, well, we all know that vaccines can sometimes cause fevers, and in children with a mitochondrial disorder, it can cause some serious damage, and it can manifest as symptoms of autism. So this is acknowledged. This isn't even controversial. And so, you have this situation where we're being told they're safe and effective, but, so the point of that is that it's an individual risk-benefit analysis that has to be done. And they don't know. This is one of the problems, that there are genetic susceptibilities. Hannah Poling had a mitochondrial disorder. So there are genetic susceptibilities such as this that, we have no idea who's at risk and who isn't. And the science isn't there yet. They're not able to say, well, This person shouldn't get a vaccine because they have a genetic predisposition to vaccine injury. They haven't done that research. They don't know, that they're not able to say. And so it really is playing Russian roulette with our children. This one size fits all policy. And this is why it absolutely has to be an individual choice, because no bureaucrat in any capital has the requisite knowledge of the individual to be able to do a meaningful risk benefit analysis for that individual. Only the individual or the child's parents, perhaps working in consultation with that child's pediatrician, that child's doctor, is able to, has that requisite knowledge to be able to make that informed choice. The idea that politicians have that knowledge is ludicrous.
Do most pediatricians even know this?
No, but there are, I think, a growing number of doctors who are aware.
Good.
The people you like to use the phrase vaccine risk aware. So I'm using the phrase health freedom movement.
Yeah.
Of course, the media slanders everyone as anti-vaxxers. I'm not anti-vaccine. I don't have a problem with vaccines per se. My problem is 100% with government policies.
Right. So what do you think? Obviously, your standard run-of-the-mill politician doesn't know anything about this. They're following what their party tells them to do, or they're truly compassionate people and they think that vaccines are safe and effective because that's, like you said, the marketing slogan. But the people who really are pushing this and have ulterior motives, what do you think those motives are?
Well, it's getting into the question of ulterior motives.
Yeah.
First, let me preface my answer by saying this. I don't take a conspiratorial view of anything vaccine related necessarily. Okay. I mean, oftentimes, again, we're called anti-vaxxers, and the reason we don't strictly comply with the CDC's schedule is because we've been misinformed and we believe in conspiracy theories and all this. And I don't see it that way at all. I mean, I don't see any conspiracy behind it. My view is totally reconcilable with policymakers and doctors and everyone involved having good intentions. My view is totally reconcilable with good intentions. So that said, when we do get into ulterior motives, I mean, number one, there's the profit margin.
Right.
The industry wants to make money, and they have a great deal going on where they're not liable for injuries from their products. Their products are mandated, so they have a guaranteed demand, because any parents who want to put their child receive a public education is required to have these vaccines, and it is becoming harder and harder for parents to be able to meaningfully exercise their right to informed consent. Parents are having to opt out rather than opting in to a mass vaccination program, which is just fundamentally a violation of the right to informed consent. For informed consent to happen, there has to be an absence of coercion. So, in other words, informed consent isn't happening. It's not happening. There is no informed consent in this country. It doesn't exist. And this is the problem. I mean, our right to informed consent is being systematically violated. And this is the problem that I've dedicated so much of my work to addressing and confronting, is that this has to change. There has to be recognition that we all have a fundamental human right to informed consent, and that vaccination has to be based on an individual choice, based on an individual risk-benefit analysis. This is the sensible, moderate view. And the idea that, well, there are some extremists on the other side saying, well, nobody should get any vaccines, and vaccines should be outlawed. And you do get some of that. I mean, true people who are really truly anti-vaccine, but then I mean the most extremists are the ones who take the view that mass vaccination is a one-size-fits-all solution. This is an extremist view. It's radical, and it's dangerous.
Well, I tell you, that wasn't nearly as exciting as Bill Gates wants to cull the herd, so to speak.
No,
but
no, I'm sorry to disappoint. Yeah, I don't subscribe to that view. Don't get me wrong. Bill Gates is heavily involved in this, and he is definitely influential. But there's this belief that he's like behind the whole pandemic, and he's behind the creation of the virus in the lab. And we could talk about that. I mean, I'm not convinced that this virus is natural in origin. I mean, to me, the leading hypothesis is lab origin, because we can talk about that if you want. But so I'm not dismissing that at all. I'm just saying I don't see that, Bill. Like there's this, the pandemic, as it's called. I just think that just goes so far beyond the evidence.
And accidents happen. I mean, I don't think it's completely outlandish. And I think that the reaction to the potential that this was, created in a lab and accidentally got out. I mean, why is that not a possibility?
Right. It's, widely dismissed as a conspiracy theory, but this is so unserious. I mean, the idea that it has a lab origin is not a conspiracy theory. It is a legitimate scientific hypothesis that is well supported with circumstantial evidence and also supported with direct evidence. And I'll give you an example. So I'm sure listeners are probably pretty broadly aware of, the fact that the Wuhan Institute of Virology is, in Wuhan. They were doing coronavirus research there, specifically doing gain of function research. Gain of function research meaning that they would take wild viruses and then genetically modify them, adapt them in the lab in order to be more virulent, more capable of infecting humans, for example. I mean, we know they were doing this research in this lab in Wuhan. We know it was funded by the National Institutes of Health. Anthony Fauci's NIAID funded an organization called EcoHealth Alliance, which in turn funneled a portion of those funds to researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So, we have all this circumstantial evidence, like the place where this outbreak happened, and it happened to be where they were doing this research. So there's all that, but then there's direct evidence in the fact that, when SARS, in 2000, 2003, there was the SARS epidemic, the first novel coronavirus. And when it entered the human population, they were able to see it adapt to the new human host. Okay, so there was and they also found the intermediary species in that case. So, coronaviruses the bats are the natural host of coronaviruses, but in this case it was civets that they found that had the virus had jumped to civets and then adapted in civets to be capable of infecting humans, and it entered the human population. But what they found is that it went through rapid mutations as it entered the human population, because when it first started infecting humans, it wasn't well adapted for our species yet. And so the virus had to adapt to its new host. And so you can see that in the evolutionary progress of the virus. That didn't happen with SARS-CoV-2. It was really interesting. There's a paper on this showing that, it entered the human population already well adapted for the human host. And in fact, it's not well adapted for bat hosts. There's another study on that. It's well adapted for infecting humans. And it entered the human population already adapted well adapted to the human host. This is really curious. This suggests that that it was not of zoonotic origin, that it was created in a lab. And of course, we have no direct evidence for this. I mean, to really prove this hypothesis, you'd need to do a forensic investigation in the lab, which of course is never going to happen. The World Health Organization has already completed its farcical so-called investigation, which was, the guy from the U.S. on that team is the same guy. He's the owner of the EcoHealth Alliance. He's the guy who was funneling the money from Anthony Fauci's NIAID to the Wuhan Institute, and he's been one of the guys out there from the beginning saying, oh, this idea that it has a lab origin is a conspiracy theory. He's been behind, this orchestrated media campaign to get the media to adopt this kind of catchphrase that, oh, it's a conspiracy theory. He's behind that. He was behind orchestrating a letter into Lancet very early on saying that, oh, this idea that it has lab origin is a conspiracy theory. And this is the guy who was on the World Health Organization's so-called investigation team, and concluding that, it's of zoonotic origin, which they haven't proven. They have not proven that. We still do not know. And this is such an important question. We need to know. If it came from the lab, for obvious reasons.
Are there any other organizations besides the WHO and China's health organization, whatever that would be called, that could do a forensic investigation of this independent of
not the type of forensic investigation I'm talking about, where they go into the lab and they go through the records and they look at the notes that were taken in there. They take samples and things, and they locate, they find out exactly what they were working on. And I don't think anyone else would be capable. There is another investigation. The Lancet has its own investigation commission. Oh. Guess who's also sitting on that commission? The same guy, Peter Daszak from EcoHealth Alliance, is also a member of the Lancet investigation team. It's a joke. It's a joke. It's a farce.
Wow.
These are not investigations. These are whitewash. They're specifically designed to try to claim that that the lab origin is not plausible, but they can't. I mean, everyone can see that these are a joke.
I mean, the only real reason that they wouldn't want it pointed at a lab is because that would look bad to China. Is that right? Or are there other reasons?
It would also look bad for the U.S. So you have the two of the most powerful governments on the planet collaborating to whitewash potentially a lab created pandemic. Maybe I'm just completely naive, but you would think that, we made a mistake would cover this because of all the other stuff that's come after it. I don't know. And I mean, even if the US funded it, you could still blame it on the Chinese scientists, which I know Trump would have been eager to do that. I don't know about China Joe, but well, Trump also ended the funding of gain of function research.
Right.
Well, it was paused under Obama, and then it was returned. I think it was actually under Trump that it went back. The NIH started funding again gain of function research. But then when he found out about the funding of the Wuhan lab, he ended the funding, not of gain of function research generally, but of EcoHealth Alliance. He cut off the funding for EcoHealth. But I think that's also been reinstated since.
That's interesting to know. Do you think that the mass hysteria being spread by the establishment bureaucrats and media is retaliatory for that?
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, if he defunded an organization that is so tied to Dr. Fauci et al.
Yeah. Well, there's no question that this whole debate has been totally politicized. And so because Trump has kind of come out saying, like he came out early on saying that, suggesting the possibility of the Chinese having created it, Chinese researchers having created it in the lab. And this was the reason for cutting off the funding. And so anything Trump touches is automatically, if Trump did it, it's bad. And if Trump believes this, then it's wrong. And, there's this kind of just politicization in terms of the coverage. Which is really unfortunate because it's not as though, again, this is the idea of lab origin is a legitimate scientific hypothesis. And so the media kind of take it as like, oh, this is just a Trump conspiracy theory or something. And it really has been largely the approach that, journalists have taken in the mainstream media. And so they just kind of dismiss it as something related to Trump. And this is absurd.
This has gotten the politics of medicine, which, I'm guessing the NIH and the CDC and the WHO have always been political organizations and we just didn't know about it. Look, I'm gay and I was a kid in the 90s when HIV was, it was just part of sex ed class that you learned about HIV, even though the vast majority of the kids in the classes were at absolutely no risk because it's, like they were saying in the 80s, it is a gay plague. Straight people just really didn't get HIV transmitted sexually very often. But we don't know that because what is the established narrative is never really corrected. It's just not reported on anymore eventually. But this has been huge and it's got a lot of people coming to understand that, hey, something fishy is going on in our medical establishment.
Well,
Do you
it's
think
really broken through into the mainstream. I want to say this, that the idea of lab origin for most of last year, it was like this was just like you couldn't talk about it.
Right.
And anytime it came up, it was a conspiracy theory. But I mean, it's really there's been some pretty major mainstream media breakthroughs in this. Wall Street Journal had a great piece by Alina Chan on it. The New York Post did a piece on it. The New York Magazine, The Intelligencer had a piece on it. Saying like, look, we have to take this seriously. This is not some kind of like loony conspiracy theory. There's legitimate reasons to believe that it may have originated in the lab, and so we need to have a serious investigation. And so this is kind of broken through into the mainstream discourse. So it's a positive development.
Yeah, I think so too. I think, and I think that the more that the just bumbling, politicization of medicine, this could end up being a pretty good thing. I think, and I think that the narrative, it wasn't so much about Trump. I mean, it was a worldwide thing against populism. And even like, the person who was considered the UK's Trump, Boris Johnson, has really gotten on board with it. So, I mean, I feel like in the long run, the more that this is exposed, and I mean, Andrew Cuomo in New York and Gavin Newsom in California are both under fire for their handling of this. Newsom he's very, very likely to be recalled, or maybe not very, very likely, but likely. The Democrats in New York are turning on Cuomo. Do you think that the pendulum is going to swing in the other direction? Or are these just sacrificial lambs to make it look like the pendulum is swinging in the other direction, and reality will continue?
That's an interesting question. Hopefully this isn't wishful thinking. I think the pendulum is going to swing. If it's not already, I think it's going to, because I think an awakening is inevitable. I mean, there's already been a huge proportion of the population who's been on to what's been happening and awake to it and speaking out against authoritarian policies. It was sad to see so many people just lay down their rights and surrender their liberty and just say, okay, we're just going to do what our overlords tell us to do unthinkingly and submissively and uncritically. That was really discouraging, but I think that's been shifting, and I think it's going to start accelerating, because I think people are going to just awaken to the realization that everything what they've been telling us from the beginning is just they haven't been honest. Like the way Cuomo was upheld as a hero.
They gave him an.
I mean, the guy literally with the highest per capita mortality rate, I think, in the world. Because someone correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I think that's the case. Is that one of the worst mortality outcomes, not just in the U.S., but I think on the planet. And the lockdown measures did nothing to protect those at greatest risk. And this is, of course, what people like me have been advocating. The authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, saying like we need to have focused protection. We need to allow people who are at very low risk, to get on with their lives and keep the economy functioning and keep putting food on their table for their families and keep being able to pay the bills and keep a roof over their families' heads. And let them go out and do that. That will also, at the same time, a benefit of that will be herd immunity isn't the goal. It's not the policy. It's not the strategy, but that's an outcome of allowing people to live their lives. And then in short time, you'll be able to allow the elderly at risk population to come out of their isolation too, because we'll have the natural herd immunity. I mean, this is what makes sense. This is what has always made sense from the beginning. This is what the pandemic planning prior to this pandemic said needs to happen. I mean, you look at the World Health Organization's pandemic planning guidance from before this pandemic. They weren't advocating like quarantining healthy people. They said not to do that. I mean, you can go through their pandemic. I mean, Sweden was the country that followed the decades of pandemic planning guidance. Sweden's not the one that performed a mass experiment on their population. Every other lockdown country is the one that performed a mass experiment on their populations by straying from the established science. And I think people are, kind of awakening to this, what's happened, and that they implemented these policies with no science to support it whatsoever. And so apart from, violating fundamental human rights and in our liberties, just from in terms of the goal, like they're doing these measures claiming to save lives, but all they're really doing is prolonging the pandemic and worsening the outcome in the long run. I mean, it's much harder to keep, when they say, well, focused protection isn't possible, this criticism of the Great Barrington Declaration,
right.
They say, well, it's not feasible. Well, it might be worth trying. I think it's feasible. To me, it makes sense because it's not feasible under their policies, because you can't indefinitely keep the whole population under lockdown and can keep elderly people in isolation indefinitely. I mean, they don't have that much a lot of them don't have much life left in them anyways. And, they're losing the quality years, whatever quality is remaining in their life, they're losing that. We're stealing that from them. And that's terrible. That's a crime, I think. And because if the pandemic was simply allowed to run its course, and I don't mean, make no effort to reduce transmission. We could still make efforts to reduce transmission. Social distancing makes sense. Masks in certain situations makes sense. We could do things to try to protect one another and reduce transmission. But if the pandemic was allowed to run its course with people behaving in a socially responsible manner, we would reach the herd immunity threshold, and then the people in isolation could come out. Whereas, when you try to just do this mass quarantine of all healthy people type of approach, all you're really doing is prolonging the inevitable, and then you're having worse outcomes in the long run because you're not protecting those people at highest risk. And we see this. It brings me back to my point about Cuomo. So it's come out now that they were apparently they were concealing information, but they were reporting the numbers of deaths from nursing care homes, and they weren't including long-term care residents who died at the hospital. And so when you count the nursing home residents who were at the hospital when they died, the numbers are far greater, evidently, is the scandal that's come to light. And so, complete and total failure. I mean, the lockdowns did nothing to protect those at highest risk.
And not only that, but Jeffrey Tucker actually has a really good article on this. It creates a whole underclass of people. I mean, the wage workers at the meatpacking plants and the grocery stores and the places that weren't shut down had to bear a huge brunt of this pandemic, in addition to the old people and prisoners and things like that who are already just, inside of institutions and can't really get out.
It's absolutely discriminatory. I mean, there are people who have, it's easy for them to live on their savings. They're wealthy. It's easy for them to work from home and have, work with Zoom meetings or whatever. A lot of people, in low income families, they don't have these same privileges. They don't have the same opportunities. They don't have the same ease of just kind of like sitting at home during lockdown and not getting on with their lives, not going to their jobs. Or they're considered essential workers. And so they're the ones out there. Well, all the upper class white guys are sitting at home, like sipping their tea and working from the internet.
Yeah, starting podcasts. I mean,
disproportionately black and underprivileged people out there being the ones kind of building up herd immunity for everyone else. I mean, it really is discriminatory. For real.
All right, Jeremy, I think that's a great place to end it. Thank you so much for coming today. Why don't you plug everything that people should access in order to follow you, including the best newsletter in the business?
Yeah, just head to jeremyrhammond.com and you'll see sign-up forms there to get on my newsletter. You'll be able to download a report, 5 horrifying facts about the FDA vaccine approval process, exclusive report for my subscribers. I wrote that before the pandemic. It's highly relevant for COVID-19 vaccines. So yeah, go to jeremyrhammond.com, get on my newsletter. It's the best way to stay updated with my work. I'm also on social, but you can find all of my social accounts once you're on my newsletter. So
cool. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right, thanks again to Jeremy for joining me today, and thank you for listening today. If you have not yet subscribed, make sure you hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening to the show, and if you are interested in receiving my written content along with email updates for every episode that I publish, head over to blackbird.substack.com, where you can sign up for either the free subscription or, if you're interested in supporting me in my work, for the paid subscription as well. And with that, I will see you on the next episode of Blackbird. And of course, until then, live free.